I grew up in a quiet suburban town, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. People went about their days with a calm routine, and the biggest thing to look forward to was the annual summer fair. Sam, my best friend, lived just 2 houses down, and from the moment we could walk, we were inseparable. We spent most of our childhood getting into harmless trouble, playing pranks on the neighbors, sneaking into the woods after dark, and of course, trying to impress the local girls. That summer night started out like any other. It was late July, and the heat of the day had given way to a warm, balmy evening. Sam and I had plans to meet up with a couple of girls, but they canceled at the last minute. Frustrated and bored, we found ourselves wandering aimlessly around the neighborhood, trying to come up with something to do. I remember Sam suddenly turning to me with that mischievous grin of his, the one that always meant trouble. "You know what we should do?" he asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's go check out the old Montgomery place." The Montgomery mansion was a local legend, a crumbling, dilapidated old house that sat on the edge of town near the cemetery. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Over the years, it had become the stuff of rumors and ghost stories. People claimed it was haunted, that weird things happened there at night, that strange lights could be seen flickering in the attic. None of that ever bothered us. In fact, Sam and I had broken into the place a few times before, but we'd never gone beyond the first floor. The upstairs and the attic were always off limits in our unspoken code, probably because, deep down, even we were a little spooked by the place. It didn't take long for Sam to convince me. We grabbed our bikes and made our way through the quiet streets toward the edge of town. As we pedaled, the street lights grew farther apart, and soon we were riding in near darkness, the only light coming from the thin crescent moon hanging low in the sky. The closer we got to the house, the more isolated it felt. The cemetery loomed on the left, its iron gate closed and rusting, while the Montgomery mansion stood just beyond, a dark silhouette against the night sky. We ditched our bikes behind a clump of bushes and stood there for a moment, staring up at the house. It was an imposing structure, even in its ruined state. The roof sagged in places, windows were shattered, and the front porch was barely hanging on by a few crooked beams. We weren't scared, not really, but there was always this weird vibe about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. "All right," Sam said, picking up a rock from the ground. "Let's start with some target practice." He lobbed the rock at one of the downstairs windows, and it shattered with a satisfying crash. Laughing, I joined in, and soon we were hurling rocks at the house like it was some kind of twisted game. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the empty street, and for a moment, we forgot about everything else. Then Sam, ever the show-off, decided to take things up a notch. He picked up a larger rock and aimed for one of the windows on the second floor, the attic. With a mighty throw, the rock arced through the air and smashed into the window. For a second, there was silence. Then something strange happened. The rock came flying back. It landed right at our feet with a dull thud, as if someone had thrown it back at us. We both froze, staring at the rock in disbelief. "What the hell?" I muttered. Sam looked just as shocked as I was, but before I could say anything, he laughed it off. "Must be some punk kids trying to mess with us," he said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Yeah, probably," I agreed, but a knot of unease had formed in my stomach. We stood there for a few minutes, waiting to see if anyone would show themselves, but the house remained silent, dark, and still. The wind rustled through the trees, but other than that, there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no sign of anyone else. It was as if the house was taunting us, daring us to come inside. Sam, never one to back down from a challenge, was the first to move. "Screw this," he said, heading for the front door. "Let's go in and see who's playing games." I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but the thought of backing out and looking like a coward in front of Sam was worse than any lingering fear I had about the house. So I followed him. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, so we pushed it open with little effort. The air inside was heavy and stale, like the house had been sealed up for years. The floorboards creaked under our feet as we stepped into the foyer, and the smell of mold and rot filled my nose. It was worse than I remembered, the decay more pronounced, the sense of abandonment almost palpable. We made our way through the first floor, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and dust-covered floors. The usual. But something was different this time. There was a feeling in the air, a heaviness that I couldn't shake. It felt like the house was watching us, waiting for something. Sam led the way, and soon we were standing at the foot of the staircase. I stared up at the darkened landing, my heart pounding in my chest. We'd never gone upstairs before. I'd always joked that the attic was where the ghosts hung out, but now, standing there, it didn't feel like much of a joke anymore. "You coming or what?" Sam called over his shoulder. With a deep breath, I followed him up the stairs, each step creaking loudly in the silence of the house. As we climbed higher, the air grew colder, and a strange sense of dread settled over me. Something about this felt wrong, but it was too late to turn back now. When we reached the attic door, Sam pushed it open without hesitation. The hinges groaned in protest, and the door swung inward, revealing a small, dusty room. The attic was just as I had imagined it, dusty, cramped, and filled with an oppressive sense of unease. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped noticeably as we stepped inside. There was barely enough light to see, just a faint glow from the moon seeping through the cracked window Sam had hit with his rock earlier. The rest of the room was a shadowy maze of old furniture covered in sheets, broken picture frames, and boxes piled haphazardly in the corners. But what caught my attention wasn't the mess. In the center of the floor, illuminated by the moonlight, was a strange symbol. A pentagram. It was drawn hastily in what looked like chalk, its lines crude and jagged, as if whoever had made it had done so in a hurry or under duress. Surrounding the pentagram were 5 unlit candles, their wax hardened and cracked with age. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. Sam, being Sam, was fascinated. He walked right up to it, crouching down to inspect the pentagram as if it were some kind of treasure. "Dude, check this out," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and curiosity. "It's like some kind of ritual or something." I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the symbol, the knot of unease in my stomach tightening with every passing second. The air felt wrong, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. "Sam, maybe we shouldn't be here," I finally said, my voice low and shaky. "This place, it doesn't feel right." Sam laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Come on, man. It's just some stupid prank. Probably some kids messing around with Ouija boards or whatever." I wasn't so sure. The pentagram, the candles, the thick, musty smell that clung to everything in the attic, it all felt too deliberate, too sinister. But before I could convince Sam to leave, he moved toward the far end of the attic where an old wardrobe stood against the wall, its doors slightly ajar. "I bet there's something cool in here," Sam said as he reached for the handle. I wanted to stop him, tell him we needed to get the hell out of there, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as Sam pulled the wardrobe door open, and that's when the smell hit us. It was the unmistakable stench of decay, thick and foul, as if something long dead had been rotting inside the wardrobe for years. I gagged, covering my mouth with my hand, and Sam stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the pentagram. "Jesus Christ!" Sam gasped, waving a hand in front of his face to try and dispel the smell. "What the hell is that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the wardrobe, and the dark, shadowy void inside it. Something was wrong, terribly, deeply wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like we had crossed a line, like we had stumbled into something we were never meant to see. Suddenly, there was a noise. A faint, rhythmic creaking sound coming from somewhere below us. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. My blood ran cold. I glanced at Sam, who had gone pale, his bravado vanishing in an instant. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, eyes wide with fear. For the first time since we had entered the house, I saw genuine panic on his face. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the attic door. Neither of us dared to move. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with dread. I could hear my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears, and I knew Sam could hear it too. Then, without warning, the door to the attic slammed shut with a deafening bang. We both jumped, our breath catching in our throats. I could see the terror in Sam's eyes, and I knew my own face mirrored the same expression. Something, was out there, standing just beyond the door. And then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible, but soon they grew louder, overlapping, a chorus of low, guttural voices that seemed to be speaking in a language I didn't understand. It wasn't English, and it wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. The voices were coming from all around us, filling the attic, but there was no one else there. "We need to leave," I hissed, my voice trembling. "Now." Sam nodded, and we both scrambled toward the window, the one he had broken earlier. It was the only way out. The stairs were no longer an option. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was blocking our escape. Sam got there first, pulling himself up onto the windowsill, but as he reached for the edge of the roof outside, he froze. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Outside, in the cemetery, there were figures. At least half a dozen of them, all dressed in long black cloaks. They were standing in a circle, their heads bowed, unmoving. The scene was illuminated only by the pale moonlight, but it was enough to see that these weren't normal people. There was something off about the way they stood, their rigid postures, the eerie stillness that surrounded them. "They're looking for us," Sam muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know how he knew, but I felt it too. The figures in the cemetery, they weren't just random strangers. They were part of whatever was happening in that house, and they were looking for us. "Go," I urged, pushing Sam toward the window. "We have to get out of here." He didn't need any more convincing. Sam crawled through the window and dropped onto the roof, and I followed close behind. The shingles were slick with dew, and we had to move carefully to avoid slipping, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me focused. We made our way across the roof, keeping low to avoid being seen by the figures below. But as we reached the edge of the roof, I heard it again, that low, rhythmic creaking sound. Footsteps, but this time they were coming from behind us. I turned around just in time to see two figures standing in the attic window, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They were watching us, their presence sending a wave of terror through my entire body. "Run!" I shouted, and without looking back, we jumped from the roof and hit the ground hard, the impact sending a jolt of pain through my legs. Sam groaned in pain, but we didn't have time to stop. We picked ourselves up and bolted, sprinting toward the cemetery gate. We tore through the cemetery, dodging between gravestones and leaping over crumbling stone markers, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The air felt heavy and oppressive, like the entire night was closing in on us, and I could still hear those whispers, those terrible, low murmurs that seemed to follow us everywhere. They weren't behind us anymore, they were all around us, echoing in the wind, in the trees, in the very earth. Sam was I. We made it. Sam. But I wasn't so sure. Something didn't feel right. The night was too quiet, too still. I turned back toward the cemetery, my heart still racing, and that's when I saw them. The figures, the ones in the cloaks. They had stopped at the edge of the cemetery, just beyond the gate, standing in a line like sentinels. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching us with th. "They're not following us," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. But I wasn't comforted by that. There was something about the way they stood, the way they watched us, that made my skin crawl. It was like they were waiting for something, biding their time. I could feel it in the air, a tension, a sense of something unfinished. "We need to go," I said, my voice hoarse and shaking. "Now." Sam nodded, and we started walking, trying to put as much distance between us and that house, that cemetery, as we could. The farther we got from the Montgomery mansion, the more the tension in my chest loosened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. "Dude, what the hell was that?" Sam finally asked, his voice shaky. "What were those things?" I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that we had stumbled into something we never should have messed with. The pentagram, the cloaked figures, the whispers, it all added up to something far darker and more dangerous than we'd ever imagined. And the worst part was, I had the sickening feeling that it wasn't over. We reached Sam's house first, and as we stood there on his porch, the adrenaline finally started to wear off. My legs were trembling, my head spinning. I leaned against the railing, trying to steady myself, but my thoughts were a chaotic mess. What had we just seen? Who were those people? Why were they in the house, and why had they let us go? "You're staying over tonight, right?" Sam asked, breaking the silence. He didn't want to be alone, and neither did I. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Yeah, I'll stay." We went inside, the house blessedly normal, a world away from the nightmare we had just escaped. But even in the comfort of Sam's living room, with the lights on and the TV buzzing quietly in the background, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Sam's parents were asleep upstairs, oblivious to everything. We didn't dare tell them what had happened. Who would believe us? 2 kids breaking into an abandoned house near the cemetery and getting spooked. People would just say it was our imagination running wild. We sat there in silence for a while, both of us too shaken to talk. Sam turned on the TV, flipping through the channels aimlessly, trying to find something, anything, that could distract us from the lingering fear. But I wasn't paying attention to the screen. My mind kept going back to the attic, to the pentagram, to the figure standing in the cemetery. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Sam asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to reassure him, to tell him that we were safe now, that whatever had happened was over. But I couldn't bring myself to lie. I had seen the way those figures had stood at the edge of the cemetery, as if they were waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had interrupted something, a ritual, a ceremony, and that they weren't finished with us yet. "I don't know," I admitted. Sam didn't say anything after that. We just sat there, the unease hanging between us like a dark cloud. The hours dragged on, and eventually, exhaustion won out. Sam fell asleep on the couch, and I stayed up for a while longer, my eyes heavy but my mind too wired to rest. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard it. At first, it was just a soft tapping, like something gently knocking against the window. I thought it was my imagination, or maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, more deliberate. A steady, rhythmic tap-tap-tap. I sat up, my heart racing, and turned toward the window. For a moment, I couldn't see anything, just the darkness outside. But then, in the faint glow of the street light, I saw it. A figure. It was standing across the street, just at the edge of the light, its face obscured by the hood of a long black cloak. My blood ran cold. They had found us. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but when I opened my eyes again, the figure was still there, standing perfectly still, watching the house. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unsure of what to do. Slowly, I backed away from the window, not daring to make a sound. My hands were shaking, my skin prickling with fear. I didn't wake Sam. I didn't want to freak him out even more than he already was. But deep down, I knew we weren't safe. Not anymore. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, my eyes locked on the window, watching the figure. It never moved, never came closer, but it stayed there, like a sentinel, watching. Waiting. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the figure was gone. But the fear didn't leave. Even as the sun rose and the normal sounds of the neighborhood returned, the birds chirping, the hum of traffic in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been marked, that we had seen something we weren't supposed to see. And whatever it wasn't finished with us. That was the last time Sam and I ever went near the Montgomery mansion. We never talked about what happened that night, not really. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking over his shoulder, his face pale and drawn, as if he could still feel their eyes on us. I knew exactly how he felt, because I felt it too. And every time I walk past the cemetery, I can't help but glance toward the old mansion. It's still there, crumbling and abandoned, but now, when I see it, I get the distinct feeling that it's not as empty as it seems. It was a Friday night, and like most weekends, we had nothing better to do than drive around our small, sleepy town. It was me, Jenny, Luca, and Kylie, 4 friends trapped in that in-between stage of adulthood where we were no longer kids, but life still hadn't really started for us yet. We were just bored, restless, really, and looking for anything to break the monotony of the same old routine. The town we lived in was a ghost of what it used to be. There wasn't much excitement here, mostly rundown shops and old neighborhoods that hadn't been touched in decades. That's when Jenny brought up the haunted house on Ash Street. You know how every town has one of those places, the kind of house kids dared each other to visit but never actually had the guts to? Well, ours was a 2-story, half-finished, abandoned house. It had been sitting there for years, half-built and decaying. I'd driven past it 1,000 times but never thought about going inside. "I say we check it out," Jenny said, her voice full of that fearless confidence she always had. Luca, who was sitting in the passenger seat next to me, glanced back at Kylie and me. "What do you think? Sounds like fun, right?" Kylie laughed nervously from the back seat. "I'm not really into creepy stuff, but sure, why not?" She tried to sound casual, but I could see her eyes widen with the same anxious curiosity that I felt. I was more skeptical, but part of me didn't want to seem like the coward of the group. "All right," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Let's do it." We drove through the quiet, desolate streets toward Ash Street. The houses in this neighborhood were older, many of them abandoned or left to rot. It was the kind of place that would give anyone the chills, even in broad daylight, but at night, it felt like the whole world had been forgotten. The car's headlights cut through the darkness as we turned onto Ash Street. There it was, looming at the end of the block like some sort of decaying monument. The house was bigger than I remembered, its frame stark and skeletal against the night sky. It looked like it had never been finished, like the construction just stopped one day and no one ever bothered to return. The windows were empty, gaping holes, and the yard was overgrown with weeds and broken branches. "Looks inviting," Luca joked, but even he sounded unsure. We parked a little way down the street, just in case anyone drove by and noticed us sneaking in. Not that anyone would care in this part of town. We stepped out into the cool night air, and I could already feel the tension rising in my chest. Jenny, always the leader of our little group, marched ahead, undeterred. She circled around the house, looking for a way in, while the rest of us stood there, feeling a little out of place. "Found it!" Jenny called out after a minute. She had climbed through one of the broken windows and was waving at us from inside. "I'll open the back door." I hesitated for a second, looking at Luca and Kylie. They both shrugged, as if to say, "We've come this far." A minute later, the back door creaked open, and we stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was this weird mixture of damp wood and something sour, almost like the stench of cat urine. The floorboards creaked under our feet as we moved into the main room. The house, or what was finished of it, had clearly been abandoned mid-construction. Some of the walls were complete, while others were just wooden frames. There was debris scattered all over the floor, old tools, scraps of wood, and random garbage left behind by whoever had come here before us. "I bet this place was supposed to be pretty nice," Luca said, kicking at a rusty hammer on the floor. "Yeah, well, it didn't turn out that way," I replied, scanning the room. It was weirdly quiet, like the whole house was holding its breath. We decided to split up. Jenny and Luca took the downstairs, while Kylie and I headed upstairs. There was an unfinished staircase that led up to the second floor, where the walls were just wooden studs, the kind of skeleton frame you see before drywall goes up. The air up here was colder, and it smelled even worse, like something rotting in the walls. I moved cautiously through the space, my flashlight beam bouncing off the exposed beams and scattered nails. It didn't look like anyone had been here for a long time, but that didn't stop the uneasiness from creeping up my spine. Then I saw it. A small door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one was closed. My heart raced a little faster as I approached it. The handle was cold to the touch, and when I turned it, the door creaked open to reveal a small, dark room. There was something in the corner, a piece of furniture, a chair, I realized as my eyes adjusted. And on the floor next to it was a book. I stepped closer and saw that it was an old, battered Bible. The pages were yellowed with age, and some of them were torn. Why would anyone leave something like this down here? That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of fabric. I froze. There, huddled against the wall, was a figure. A woman, her long hair tangled and matted, wearing a dirty, old-fashioned dress. She was just sitting there, not moving, her face hidden in the shadows. I took a step back, my pulse thudding in my ears. Guys?" I called out, my voice shaky. But before I could say anything else, I heard a scream from downstairs. It was Kylie. I bolted back down the stairs as fast as I could. By the time I reached the ground floor, Luca was already by the door, calling my name frantically. Jenny was pulling Kylie toward the exit. "Go! We need to go!" Jenny shouted, her voice high with panic. I didn't need to be told twice. We ran, the cold night air hitting our faces as we rushed back to the car. None of us looked back. Not even once. When we finally slammed the doors shut, my heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. "What the hell happened back there?" I asked, breathless. Kylie was shaking, tears in her eyes. There were two men, just standing there, in one of the rooms. Luca and Jenny were just as freaked out. "I don't know what they were doing," Luca said, "but something wasn't right." None of us had an answer, but one thing was clear. We were never going back there again. We sat in the car, all of us panting, staring at each other with wide, fearful eyes. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, making it hard to think straight. No one said a word for what felt like forever. The only sound was our collective breathing and the hum of the engine idling beneath you. Kylie was still trembling, holding herself tightly in the back seat. Jenny sat beside her, arms crossed, staring out the window with a dazed expression. Luca, beside me in the passenger seat, kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to come chasing aft. "What the hell did we just see?" I finally asked, my voice. Kylie took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. I don't know. They were just standing there." Her voice cracked. "It was like they were waiting for us." "Waiting?" I repeated, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Lucas shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't even see them at first," he admitted, his voice low. "It wasn't until Kylie screamed that I noticed them, two men, standing in that empty room, just watching us." "Were they homeless?" Jenny asked, finally breaking her silence, though her voice was hollow. "Maybe they've been living in that house." "I don't know," I muttered. "But if they were just squatters, why didn't they say anything? Why didn't they move?" There was a moment of heavy silence. Something didn't add up. The way Kylie had described them, the way Luca had reacted, this wasn't just a case of stumbling onto some drifters. There was something more sinister about it. Something wrong. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I shifted the car into drive and started down the empty street, away from that cursed house. No one protested. As I drove, my mind kept replaying everything that had happened. The abandoned house, the woman upstairs, the strange men downstairs, it all felt like a nightmare. But there was one part that gnawed at me more than anything else. The woman I saw in the corner, sitting there, so still, so silent. I hadn't mentioned her to the others yet. Part of me was still trying to process it. Who was she? Why was she there? And why hadn't she reacted to my presence? Do you think they were a part of something? Jenny asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence in the car. She turned to look at me, her face pale. Like a cult or something? Luca scoffed, but it wasn't his usual cocky tone. Come on, Jenny, that's ridiculous. Is it? She shot back, her eyes narrowing. I mean, think about it. The house is abandoned, right? But it wasn't empty. What if it's being used by, I don't know, a group or something? People don't just stand around like that for no reason. A chill ran through me at the thought. Cults. It wasn't something you usually thought about in our small town, but stranger things had happened. I glanced at Luca, who was rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. He didn't seem so sure anymore either. I saw something too, I said quietly, finally speaking up. All three of them turned to look at me, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. What did you see? Kylie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a woman, I began, my throat suddenly dry. Upstairs, in one of the rooms. She was just sitting there, against the wall. She didn't move, didn't say anything. She just sat there, like she was waiting for something. Jenny's eyes widened. A woman? I nodded. Her hair was long and messy, like she hadn't washed it in weeks. She looked out of place. I don't know how else to explain it. It didn't feel right. Kylie let out a shaky breath. Do you think she was part of it? Like with those men? I don't know, I said honestly. But something wasn't right about her. She didn't react to me being there, didn't even acknowledge I was in the room. It was like she was in some kind of trance. Jenny shifted uncomfortably in her seat. What if she's still there? What if they're all still in that house right now? Lucas shook his head, trying to shake off the fear. We're overthinking this. It's just an old house. We probably scared some squatters, and that's it. But I wasn't so sure. The image of that woman, sitting there so still, her face hidden in the shadows, was burned into my memory. And there was something else, a detail I hadn't thought about until now. Something that sent a fresh wave of unease through me. The Bible, I muttered, almost to myself. What? Luca asked, turning to look at me. There was a Bible, I repeated louder this time. It was on the floor, right next to the chair where the woman was sitting. It looked old, worn out. Why would they leave a Bible there? Kylie's eyes widened. That's weird, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Jenny stared at me, her expression unreadable. Maybe they're not just squatters. Maybe there's something else going on in that house. We all sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Jenny's words settling over us like a suffocating blanket. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. There was something off about that place, something more than just an abandoned building. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out, expecting a message from my parents asking when I'd be home, but instead, I saw a notification I didn't recognize. A text. From an unknown number. The message was short, just 4 words. You shouldn't have left. My blood ran cold. My hands shook as I showed the others the screen. Their faces went pale, eyes wide with the same fear that was now coursing through my veins. Who sent that? Kylie stammered, her voice trembling. I don't know, I whispered, my mind racing. My first instinct was to check the number, but it was just a random string of digits. No name, no contact info, nothing. Luca grabbed the phone from me, his face pale. This has to be some kind of prank, he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered. Someone saw us there, followed us, and now they're messing with us. Then how do they have my number? I shot back, my voice rising. We didn't see anyone except those men, and the woman. A heavy silence fell over the car. None of us had an answer. None of us knew what was going on, but one thing was clear, we'd seen something we weren't supposed to. And now someone, or something, was watching us. I don't care what's going on. Jenny said finally, her voice firm. "We are not going back to that house. Ever." I nodded in agreement, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever was happening, it had followed us out of that house. And it wasn't going to let us go so easily. It was a chilly evening in October 2017, the kind of night that made you feel a shiver run down your spine even before you knew what was coming. I remember it vividly, almost as if it happened yesterday. My name is Alex, and that night, my friends and I were about to embark on what I thought would be a thrilling adventure but turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. I had recently been accepted into a fraternity at my university, and one of the traditions of the fraternity was to explore a notorious abandoned hospital located just outside of town. The tales of the hospital's haunted past and the eerie experiences of previous visitors had circulated around campus, making it a rite of passage for new members. A mix of excitement and dread bubbled in my stomach as I arrived at the meeting point, a small park adjacent to the woods surrounding the hospital. Ethan, my close friend from the fraternity, met me there. He was always the daredevil of our group, eager to prove himself and drag the rest of us along for the ride. A group of about 10 guys, all eager to partake in the initiation, gathered around. We parked our cars in the dimly lit lot and prepared ourselves for the hike through the thick woods that led to the crumbling building. The leaves crunched underfoot, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. As we trekked through the forest, the wind whispered secrets among the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was just our imagination, I told myself. The night was darker than usual, the moon obscured by thick clouds that rolled in, casting shadows that danced ominously around us. We reached the hospital's exterior, a massive structure that loomed over us, its cracked walls and shattered windows exuding an aura of despair. We entered through a window that had been smashed long ago. The sound of glass crunching beneath our boots echoed in the empty halls, and a chill enveloped us. The lobby was filled with remnants of the past, old wheelchairs, dusty medical equipment, and faded posters warning of dangers that once lay within these walls. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of history, and I could almost hear the whispers of the souls who had once walked these halls. After gathering ourselves, we made our way to the second floor, our footsteps echoing ominously. The floor creaked under our weight, each sound amplifying the tension in the air. We split up into smaller groups for a better exploration, and Ethan suggested we venture into a separate hallway. I felt a sense of unease, but the thrill of adventure outweighed my reservations. We entered a patient's room filled with dusty old beds and medical instruments draped in cobwebs. The air felt heavy and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed for decades. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a dark figure slipping past the doorway, almost like a shadow that didn't belong. My heart raced, and I turned to Ethan, my eyes wide. "Did you see that?" I whispered, trying to suppress the rising panic within me. Ethan nodded, his bravado faltering for the first time. We stepped out into the corridor, cautiously peering down its length. At the far end stood a silhouette. Someone, or something, was there. It was too far to make out any details, but the figure stood unnaturally still, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't tell if they were facing us or if their back was turned. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the urge to retreat, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. Then, the piercing scream of a woman shattered the silence, echoing from the hallway we had just come from. The sound was raw and filled with terror, sending shockwaves through our group. I felt my breath itch, and without thinking, Ethan and I bolted back towards our friends, hearts pounding in our chests. As we rounded the corner, the others were already scrambling toward the staircase, panic etched on their faces. "What happened?" one of the guys shouted, his voice quaking with fear. I opened my mouth to explain what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come out. The adrenaline coursed through me as I joined the stampede down the stairs. My mind raced, trying to process the fear that had gripped us all. We burst through the entrance and scrambled out the window, tumbling onto the damp grass outside. The night air was a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the hospital. I could still hear the echo of that scream, resonating in my ears. As we gathered in a frantic huddle, trying to make sense of the chaos, I glanced back at the hospital. The darkness seemed to swallow the building whole, as if it was hiding something sinister within its walls. "Did anyone see who screamed?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The group exchanged anxious glances, each of us realizing that we had all been touched by the same wave of terror. No one knew who had screamed, or if anyone had been left behind. Ethan broke the silence, his voice shaky. "We need to get out of here. Now." The urgency in his tone sent another shiver down my spine, and without another word, we all turned to flee toward the parking lot. As we dashed through the trees, I felt a presence behind us, a sensation that something was following, a predator lurking in the shadows. The sound of footsteps echoed ominously, matching our frantic pace. Finally, we reached the cars, panting and wide-eyed, relief flooding over us. I locked eyes with Ethan, who looked just as terrified as I felt. I turned to the group, breathless, and relayed what I had seen, the figure, the scream, the overwhelming sense of dread. The more I spoke, the more palpable the fear became, settling over us like a heavy fog. As we climbed into our cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had left something behind, something waiting in that hospital, something that had stirred from its slumber, angry at our intrusion. That night, we made a pact. None of us would ever return to that place again. The days turned into weeks, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Classes resumed, and the excitement of college life distracted me from that harrowing night. Yet, the memory of the hospital lingered in my mind, creeping into my thoughts at the most unexpected moments. The whispers of my friends around campus about our initiation adventures sometimes resurfaced, but I brushed them off, refusing to acknowledge the fear that still resided within me. Then one evening, as the semester wound down and Halloween approached, Ethan called me. His voice crackled with excitement and a hint of mischief. "Hey man, let's do something crazy! I found a group that's planning to go back to the hospital. They want to do a ghost hunt." My heart dropped. "You can't be serious! After what we experienced? There's no way I'm going back there." I protested, but Ethan's enthusiasm was infectious. "Come on, Alex! It'll be fun! We can't let that place win, right?" After a long, internal struggle, I found myself unable to refuse. I didn't want to seem cowardly in front of my friends. Maybe we could face our fears together and prove that there was nothing to be scared of. So, against my better judgment, I agreed to join Ethan and the group. The night of the ghost hunt arrived, the air electric with a sense of foreboding. The group assembled at the same park where we had begun our first expedition. As I looked around, I saw a mix of familiar faces and strangers, all buzzing with excitement and anticipation. Flashlights flickered to life, illuminating the path as we marched through the woods once more. As we approached the hospital, a sense of dread washed over me. The building loomed in the darkness, more ominous than I remembered. We gathered in the lobby, our voices hushed, the weight of what we were about to do sinking in. The plan was simple: split into smaller groups, explore different parts of the hospital, and use our phones to capture any signs of paranormal activity. Ethan and I joined a group that included 2 other guys and a girl named Mia, who seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the whole endeavor. We ventured up to the 2nd floor, where the oppressive air seemed to thicken around us. Each creak of the floorboards under our weight echoed like a warning bell. Mia led the way, her flashlight beam dancing across the walls, illuminating the remnants of a world long forgotten. "Look at this!" she exclaimed, pointing to an old patient's room filled with decrepit furniture. "This is so cool!" I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the walls were whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I turned to Ethan, who was visibly uneasy but trying to mask it with forced bravado. "Are you sure about this?" I muttered. "Just stick together, man," he replied, though his voice lacked confidence. We pushed deeper into the hospital, the air growing colder as we moved further from the light of our flashlights. Suddenly I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but enough to send chills racing down my spine. I paused, my breath hitching in my throat. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Hear what? Mia turned, a puzzled expression crossing her face. Ethan looked just as confused, but the other guys seemed unfazed. I swear I just heard something, I insisted, but as I strained to listen, the sound faded away, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that was creeping in again, convincing myself it was just the echoes of the past playing tricks on my mind. We moved to another room, the atmosphere thick with the weight of memories. The darkness felt almost alive, pressing in around us. As we explored, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting past the doorway. My heart raced, and I felt the urge to call out, but fear paralyzed me. Guys, we should go back, I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. Don't be such a wuss, Alex, one of the guys joked, but his laughter was hollow, tinged with an edge of nervousness. Before I could respond, Mia gasped, her flashlight illuminating a blood-stained wall, the words, "Get out," scrawled in what looked like dried paint. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. This can't be real, I muttered, but the feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. Just then, we heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a woman screaming, echoing through the halls like a siren. My blood turned to ice. It was the same scream we had heard before, the one that had sent us fleeing from the hospital. Panic surged through me as I grabbed Ethan's arm. We need to leave. Now! The others, realizing the gravity of the situation, turned pale. The excitement of the ghost hunt evaporated, replaced by a palpable fear. We sprinted down the hallway, hearts pounding in sync with the adrenaline coursing through us. As we reached the staircase, I glanced back, expecting to see the shadowy figure, the source of that scream. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the abandoned hospital, as if it had swallowed our fear whole. We barreled down the stairs and out through the window, tumbling onto the grass outside. The cool night air rushed over us, a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere within. We gathered at the edge of the woods, gasping for breath, fear etched on our faces. What just happened? One of the guys exclaimed, his voice shaking. Did we all hear that? Yes, I shouted, the panic rising again. We need to get away from here. Ethan's face was pale as he tried to calm us down, but the fear in his eyes told me he felt it too. Let's just get back to the cars. We'll figure this out. As we made our way back through the trees, the feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before. I could hear footsteps behind us, matching our pace. I dared not look back, terrified of what I might see lurking in the shadows. When we finally reached the parking lot, I felt a rush of relief. But as I turned to face the group, a sinking realization washed over me. One of our friends was missing. Wait! Where's Mia? I shouted, panic rising in my throat. We searched frantically, calling her name, but the only response was the echo of our voices in the night. She was right behind us, Ethan insisted, his eyes wide with fear. With every passing moment, the reality of our situation sank in. We had to go back. The thought terrified me, but we couldn't leave her behind. We returned to the entrance, the darkness swallowing us as we stepped inside. My heart raced, pounding against my ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. We split up again, calling for Mia, our voices swallowed by the silence. After what felt like an eternity of searching, I heard a faint whisper, one that sent chills down my spine. Help me! Mia! I called out, racing towards the sound. The darkness seemed to close in around me, the walls whispering their secrets, taunting me. As I rounded a corner, I froze. There she was, standing in a dimly lit hallway, staring blankly at a door. Her eyes were wide with fear, and as I approached, I felt an unnatural chill wash over me. Mia, what happened? I asked, my voice trembling. I don't know, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. I heard something, and then I lost you guys. Before I could respond, the temperature dropped drastically, and I felt a presence behind me, a dark force pressing against my back. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the shadows danced, twisting and turning as if alive. We turned to run, but as we did, the door behind us slammed shut, trapping us inside. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, desperate to escape. "Help! Let us out!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the stillness. But the only response was silence, the darkness swallowing our cries. I turned to Mia, who was trembling beside me, her eyes filled with fear. "What's happening?" she whimpered, and for the first time, I didn't have an answer. In that moment, we understood that we had crossed a line, trespassing into a realm we didn't belong in. The hospital wasn't just a building, it was a tomb for the souls that once roamed its halls, and we were intruders in their sanctuary. As the darkness closed in, I realized that this was no longer just a ghost hunt, it was a fight for our lives. The chilling screams echoed once more, a reminder of the horrors that awaited us if we didn't escape. With one final push, we rammed against the door, and to our relief, it flew open, the darkness retreating. We stumbled out into the hallway, adrenaline fueling our flight as we raced down the stairs, not daring to look back. Bursting through the entrance, we tumbled onto the grass outside, gasping for breath. The rest of our group stood waiting, their faces pale and drawn, as they processed the terror we had just experienced. "I'm done!" I gasped, my heart racing. "I'll never come back here again." Ethan nodded in agreement, and as we drove away from the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling of something watching us from the shadows. I knew I had glimpsed something that night, something dark and powerful that I could never fully understand. From that day on, I vowed never to return to places like that again. The darkness within those walls was not meant for us. It was a reminder that some doors are better left unopened, and some stories are best left untold.